We have a really terrific panel assembled today, spanning from a general manager to a consultant who is working with over a dozen districts, to a former Texas Water Development Board executive with great experience on water data, and add in a cutting-edge researcher working in data today and helping us design what is possible in the next 5 to 10 years. So we have the full spectrum: Texas-specific data providers, data users, tool providers, and researchers. I would like to invite Mike, Erin, Robert, and Suzanne to the stage right now to join me, and I'll do a quick introduction of each. Great. So please help me in welcoming our 4 guests. So a quick introduction: Erin. Erin is Vice President and Practice Leader for GIS and Technology at Halff Associates. Since joining Halff in 2001, he has had the opportunity to lead a wide variety of water resources projects that integrate GIS, Geographic Information Systems, traditional database, and web applications to create streamlined client solutions using the latest technology. He's had the privilege to work with 15 groundwater conservation districts in Texas to develop custom web-based groundwater management systems for mapping, monitoring, and managing the wells and their associated permits, owners, drillers, water levels, water quality, and production. At the far end is Robert Mace, who is the Interim Executive Director and Chief Water Policy Officer at the Meadows Center for Water and the Environment at Texas State. Before joining Texas State in 2017, Robert worked at the Texas Water Development Board for 17 years, ending his career there as the Deputy Executive Administrator for the Water Science and Conservation Office. Next to Robert is Suzanne. Suzanne is a research scientist with the Texas Advanced Computing Center. She's a lecturer for the Environmental Science Institute in the Jackson School of Geosciences at the University of Texas at Austin. And Dr. Pierce is a computational hydrogeologist. Michael is a general manager of the Harris-Galveston Subsidence District, as well as the Fort Bend Subsidence District. As a general manager, he's the chief administrative officer responsible for the management of district operations and for developing goals, strategies, and policies necessary to implement the district's legislated mandates. Mr. Turco leads a customer-focused team supporting the district's mission of reasonable groundwater regulation, protect lives and property in Harris, Galveston, and Fort Bend counties from the hazards associated with land subsidence. Okay, so please welcome the panelists. So today we really wanted to focus on how data is used and the context of that data, and most importantly, the success stories. So we're going to walk through each of the individual panelists. I've invited them to offer about 5 minutes of remarks on a success story that they'd like to share. And I thought we'd start actually with Michael, if you wanted to share a few comments from the perspective of being a GM.
Well, thanks for having me today. It's really an honor to be amongst this group and talk about something that I feel really passionate about, which is data. I spent 17 years with the U.S. Geological Survey before I joined the district, and when you're at the GS, you learn a really strong appreciation for data, good quality data, and collecting that information, because it's so important as you make interpretations moving down the road. Last night, I was actually reading a journal article from the journal Geology from the 1920s. That was talking about, it was by Pratt and Johnson. It was about the Goose Creek oil field. And the Goose Creek oil field was the first documented case where groundwater extraction had led to subsidence. It's a very, very classic example of that. But all the way back in the 1920s, the data collection actually continued and moved forward till today in the area of Houston as it relates to subsidence and groundwater withdrawal. The Subsidence District is a great example of how groundwater data, superficial land deformation data, and other types of information can be brought together to help solve a problem on a regional scale like we have with subsidence. It really extends beyond Houston. It goes all the way into Fort Bend, Brazoria, Liberty, Chambers, Montgomery, Waller County, Austin County. It gets way out. It's a very broad area. But data plays into this from the get-go. 1920s, it was determined that groundwater causes subsidence. 1940s, a lot of folks come in, population grows, water use increases. And then outcry from the public began the need for some regulation to solve the subsidence problem. The Subsidence District was created in 1975, and from that point forward, working with the USGS and many other agencies, both at the state, private consultants, began gathering and piecing together a body of work that includes groundwater data, groundwater use, land deformation, working with the National Geodetic Survey, working with local universities, to where we are today, where we have a 200-node network that looks at land deformation, not only within the district, but in the surrounding communities. We also have researchers from all around the state using now recently remote sensing techniques to use satellite data to look at deformation in the area. All of that coming together to serve as the foundation for reasonable regulation that's taken that area from what was primarily a groundwater user to what is now rapidly shifting from groundwater to surface water. To give you an example, Galveston County and the Ship Channel area is now at 10% and 20% of their total water demand alternative to groundwater, with only 10 or 20% being groundwater of their water demand. So it's a dramatic shift, and you only get that shift when you base those regulations on good, sound, quality data. And as we move forward, you heard Kathleen Jackson talk this morning about the largest water infrastructure project in the country going on right now in Houston. That project is to facilitate the next conversion requirements that are based on all of that information that are going on right now in Houston. Well, they'll go from what is 70% groundwater today to 20% groundwater by 2035. So sound, good hydrologic data, sound data collection along the way has helped build the foundation for all those regulations and the need to, and the information that helps us better sell the idea that in order to solve this problem, to avoid the flooding and the infrastructure damage and the other damage that comes from subsidence in the region, these are the kind of steps you have to make. So good sound data helps us build that collaboration in the region.
Great, thank you. Mike? Erin.
All right. Thank you for having me here today. Really excited to be here. Halff has had the opportunity to work with a number of districts spread across the state, so we get to see a lot of different aspects in which they use. And so when Glen was asking, what kind of challenges we see, well, we see a really broad range of challenges, that each one's unique. But one commonality that I think is there is, the challenge of answering a question. Some questions are real simple. Maybe your opinion is good enough. But when we have ranches that are going to sell for $500 million for water rights, sometimes those questions that are asked, your response is going to be challenged. And how do you go about answering those kinds of questions? So as Mike just said, having good sound data, what is the measure of good quality information? For an easy one, taking water levels, to say that you have a water level that's 55 feet down, that's good. You now know what the measurement is, but when was it collected? It's a little bit more valuable if you say it was collected in 2005. But if you contrast that with it was collected by the general manager on June 1st, 2005, it was measured at 55 feet, it was done with a steel tape, now you're starting to really have a better picture of what that water level measurement looks like. And that's building data on top of data. The metadata that backs up how you're going to answer that information. And you can take that same scenario and stretch it out. If you're going to be looking at water levels over time, obviously you need a historical period. Our aquifers, they stretch over vast areas. Where is that monitoring well located? Is it in the outcrop or is it in a confined location of the aquifer? As you start building up all this data, it does sound like a lot, but as the commissioner mentioned earlier in the panel, if we're going to base our decisions on science, you have to have good data to do that. And so it's not just a single measurement or just the ancillary information of the historical time period, but you have to be able to back up all that information. Because when people are going to challenge you on how that information is being presented, if you can produce the data quickly, I think that's where you're going to have a lot of success. And so the way in which we've met that challenge is, the information, there's a lot of it. It takes a lot of time. So we've been providing solutions that allow you to collect that information digitally. It prompts you for all the information. If you're collecting it with an air gauge, which one did you use? When was the last time it was calibrated? And so if you can produce all that information quickly to those that are asking those questions, I think you have a lot to stand on when you're trying to defend your responses to these tough questions that are going to be asked.
Great, thanks. Robert?
So how many of y'all have either used or directly benefited from Texas Water Development Board's Groundwater Database online? All right. How many of y'all have benefited or used from the water well drillers database that the board also has at its website? So now imagine for a minute if those databases didn't exist. Right, did your heart stop? Looking back at my years at the Water Development Board, and even pre-Water Development Board, I adored, and still adore that groundwater database. And that is, in many ways, open data. It's data that's been collected over decades that somebody, and I don't know who it is, I know there's a long chain of people who are responsible for that, including Phil Nordstrom, Janie Hopkins, Brian Anderson, David Thorkelson, that worked to get that data, online and available for folks to use. I worked on a study in the Permian Basin late last year, and I've been around long enough to when the submitted water well drillers reports only existed in hard copies. And I would have to go over to TCEQ and spend days, hours after hours, flipping through paper files and then copying that information over. I was thinking yesterday we maybe got that water well drillers database online 5 years ago. It's been 16 years. Time flies. So some of y'all that are younger don't even remember a time when that data wasn't available. And again, working on that study, I was able, in a day, to access and analyze information that in the past would have taken months at a much greater cost to figure out what was going on. Again, that's the power of having data, but then more importantly, making that data available and open for people to access and to use. You could probably argue that a number of groundwater districts maybe wouldn't exist if that database wasn't there and that data wasn't there to show that there were groundwater issues and problems with water levels. There probably wouldn't be the groundwater availability models. There's so many things that have leverage. Also, just think of the economic impact of that data. Anybody can go in and look to see, what's the water quality, groundwater quality like in my area? What well yield might I get? And that has, supported agriculture, supported industry, it's supported our understandings on surface water groundwater interactions. And so kind of looking back at a big picture, I see that as a major success. And it has those elements of making that data findable and accessible for people to go use, for researchers, for groundwater district managers, for consultants. I guess I'm a researcher now too. I'm an academic too. It's just invaluable, and that's one thing about data. There's collecting the data, and a lot of people say, well, data's not terribly sexy. I mean, I think it's sexy. I think, yeah. I mean, I get a little turned on with about data, but it's it can be hard to convince board members, legislature, governing bodies about the importance of data, but that is the foundation. And then, creative folks then taking that data, because sometimes you're collecting data and you're thinking, well, we're just measuring the water levels to see what's happening from year to year, and lo and behold, someone can take that data and find out something about recharge rates, find out something about where groundwater is flowing from and where it's going to, how long resources might last. Any innumerable things can be done. And Harvey, even with Harvey, there was a groundwater component to that disaster, because when the floodwaters came, it swamped out a number of folks' wells. And so then the question was, well, where are those wells, and what do those people need to do to make it safe for drinking water again? So when you're thinking about open data and the value of open data, think about that Texas Water Development Board groundwater well database, and if that wasn't around. And that's an indication of the potential of open data across the spectrum in the water world.
It's hard. It's always hard to follow well-spoken folks. Everyone's made great comments. I'll riff a little bit on the fact that Robert admits that data can be sexy. Data are also profoundly dumb. Data are dumb. Like, let's be honest. Data are the core thing that we need to help us describe what's going on, but I'm a computational hydrogeologist, which sounds like a really weird thing. And what does that mean? It means I sit at the Texas Advanced Computing Center. So I'm surrounded by computer scientists every day, about 150 of them. We spend most of our time, most of those 150 people are trying to figure out how to help accelerate discoveries and how to streamline people's ability to solve or evaluate and analyze really complicated problems. One of the big wins that our center has had recently is, you may have heard about the gravitational wave discovery. This is a century ago or more, Albert Einstein and other physicists believed that you could actually detect whether or not a black hole collapsed or if two supernovas collided, and they theorized forever about how you might be able to do that. In a place like TAC, which is one of the largest supercomputing centers here on Earth, and we have 16 supercomputing resources. They, as it turns out, are both funded by federal money, but this is important for everyone in this room. We are a state resource. So this is the Texas Advanced Computing Center. We are your resource. We also, just a month ago or so, well, let me finish the LIGO story. So you heard about LIGO, which was the gravitational wave discovery. What happened was all of the supercomputer centers and all of these computer scientists figured out how to accelerate the workflows so that they could detect data signals. These gravitational waves move faster than the speed of light, so you need to be able to catch that sensor signal really quickly and evaluate it to decide whether or not you've got something that's meaningful and useful. That was a huge discovery that after over 100 years or more of not knowing if it really existed, we were able to use the data to prove that, in fact, Einstein was right yet again. And yes, indeed, gravitational waves do happen when massive galactic events occur. And that's really cool. But here's what's even better, is all of that technology development can now be turned and applied to groundwater problems as well. And that's what's really super cool. And the thing about data being profoundly dumb is we need to figure out how to unlock the knowledge. And as a computational hydrogeologist, I studied the science a long time ago, but what I realized pretty quickly in my doctoral work was the real problems are about how do you help people have deep dialogue that's based on the data, because the scientists and the engineers, we're not going to be able to give you the solutions that matter for where you live. You're going to need to help us understand, or we're going to have to help you look at your data and find the meaning so that you can have deeper conversations, so that you can both react in times of conflict, hopefully react in time to avoid conflict, even better, and even better than that, prior to even the inkling of a problem, find a shared vision with your community for how you want to manage the resources that are available to all of you, and do it wisely and do it well, using the best available information from all of the incredible resources we've got across the state, which is very exciting. So Texas Advanced Computing Center, we're trying to figure out how to build the tools that will help you to reason and access and use and analyze this data so that it becomes meaningful and can help you have the conversations that are necessary for you to make the decisions that matter. I think that I'll stop there.
So we have data is sexy, data is dumb. We're talking cosmic, galactic, so we're spanning the whole range here. There was a really great comment from the previous panel about how geology doesn't respect jurisdictions. And I wanted to ask a question for Michael and Erin, because you guys represent a GM as well. You You've worked with over, I think, 15 different districts. Can you talk a little bit about how data facilitates collaboration? Because I think we all agree it's not about the data, it's not necessarily about science, it's about the conversations that are enabled by that.
Yeah, and I think it's obvious that even though we may have a single county or multi-county district, we all work better when we work together. And one of the things that data collection in itself allows us to do is to find very common ground to collaborate. We've worked, the Subsidence District has worked with the City of Houston, all of the neighboring groundwater conservation districts, the neighboring Subsidence districts to collect data, groundwater level data in the region since the 70s. And the value to that is immense because the landscape has changed over time and development. If you think about Houston, it's a very big city. Houston builds out, not up generally. So it just continues to spread out and get further and further away from its center and begins to see more development in areas that maybe at the beginning of that data set were primarily rural or transitioning to suburban. So that land use change is important for us because as we look at the impacts of not so much flood, because floods come a lot down in our area, but drought. Droughts are important. And they may be important for you for a different reason they're important for us. For us, what droughts means that people use more water. Doesn't really have a big short-term impact in recharge, but it has a big impact on water use. And that impacts groundwater levels. And to be able to capture that in the data on a super regional scale is really important for us because our job is to take population growth and water demands out into the future, use groundwater models and computing techniques to help us understand how the system works and then project and simulate down the road what might happen with all the new population and where they're going to move to and how that might be impacted by drought. So the collaboration that happens in that is important because you need to have that local institutional knowledge to be able to better understand what you're predicting may happen in an area that may not necessarily be in your area but just next door. When we were talking amongst ourselves a little earlier, I made the point to say that the data you collect today really isn't for today, and it's not. I mean, it's good, but many of us aren't making actionable decisions today on the data we collect today. But that data, it gets more value as it gets older. It's like a fine wine. You know, the more older that data is, the more you can compare it to things down the road. And when you have data that you can compare 30, 40 years beyond, you can capture droughts in the middle of that, and you can make all those interpretations. It helps you better simulate what happens so that you can better simulate what's going to happen in the future. So all of that requires collaboration amongst your local partners and your regional partners. And if you don't have that, it really hamstrings your ability to make actionable decisions down the road.
Thank you, Mike. Yeah, collaboration is definitely key. We're currently working with 4 districts. They're all part of the same GMA. And so one of the things that they're asking about is, you know, what are your water level measurements compared to mine? And so when they're looking at DFCs, you know, the aquifer obviously does not respect the jurisdictional boundary, but they still need to manage it the same way. And so they're looking at ways to look where are they collecting it, how do they space out their monitoring wells, what is their data collection methods, are they comparable, so that when they go to working on their GAMs and looking at their DFCs, they know that the data is in line with each other, and the only way they're going to do that is through good collaboration and open discussion and having some transparency between the districts so that they know what each other's doing.
Great. I have a question for Suzanne and Robert. In the previous panel, there's a lot of discussion about how bad policy results from a lack of information. And we talked about education and communication are really important. But I think I understood most of what you guys said because some of the things you said were quite complicated. But if you think about really sophisticated, both the data and the science, how do we make that really simple? Because that operative word, simple, is what allows people to make those better decisions. So how do we take the complicated and make it simple?
So, oops, is it on? Yeah. So we spend a lot of time thinking about how to attach the metadata so that we can label and connect information inside big data systems so that you can take the databases and have interconnectivity so that the the machines that you're trying to teach how to think, right? They're not going to think like humans, but they're going to assist us. We try to think about how to inform that machine about what's inside the data as quickly as possible. We talk a lot about creating Google for groundwater. You know, I've got to put together my groundwater management plan for the next 5-year period. How am I going to do that? Let's Google it. Let's find it. Let's search what's possible inside the data sets. Try to get a recommendation so you can think about these things are already in your life. If any of you are using Netflix or Amazon to order your books, you're getting recommender systems where they'll actually see that you, in my case, I like Disney movies and cartoons a lot, so I get a lot of recommendations for cartoon stuff. So when it's recommending what you might enjoy, it's a similar concept. Can we look at what all of the groundwater districts are doing? Can we evaluate what was successful in those other places? And then can we make a recommendation to help you use your data and your GAMs and your models to then project into the future to see if that same strategy might work for you? So that's one way that we're trying to simplify it. So you don't ever want to take the human out of the machine. People will make the decisions. The machines are going to assist and help us to build better options for ourselves as we're talking through what matters.
I think there's a real need to develop systems that allow decision makers to easily interact with the data. And so like a fundamental concept of open data is like you have your data, you have your data, and you have your data. Nobody's going to take your data. You still have your data, but you're going to put it or make it available for, say, someone like Suzanne to be able to reach out and grab your data. She's going to, you still have full control of your data, but now she's going to be able to use it and perhaps integrate across boundaries, and then use it to develop a tool that then a decision maker can, or maybe just someone in the public who's interested can then interact with it. And then she might also pull in geology data, might also pull in community water system data. And depending what your decision is, then you can make decisions. The kind of the water data initiative in Texas is trying to develop this hub, which was funded by the legislature under the auspices of creating a flood dashboard. So like during the horrific floods that hit Hays County on the Blanco River, the emergency manager had like 20 different screens of information up to make decisions on the fly in an emergency situation. And you can imagine how complicated that was. He had to bring all those up, bring them up. They're not at the same scale. He can't overlap them. But now imagine a system where all that data, each of those information from each of those websites is available, and somebody develops a tool where now he has one screen and he flips things on and off. And he can look at relationships and make decisions on the fly. So I think that's what really then helps people to, having that data available, and then somebody developing a tool then where you can use that data to make important decisions.
So data, the whole conversation about water data in particular always turns to the quality of that data. And there's often a complaint that there isn't good enough data and you get crap outs. So specific to what you guys have done in Texas in the past, dispel that myth. Is there a good enough water data, good quality data for Texas to make the kinds of decisions that you think are needed?
So is the question, is the data out there?
Yeah, and is it good enough?
Well, data comes in all shapes and flavors, and I think the important part is to be aware of the quality of your data. I think there's a lot of good information about how to collect the data, and depending on what that data is, there's a lot of resources for the data. But when we're handling the information that we collect in the district, we have to be mindful to always qualify that the source of that information, all of the information that we can gather at the site when we're collecting that data, so that down the road, particularly down the road when methods improve and methodologies are changed, we can then compare that data apples to apples to data that was collected previously when maybe we didn't have steel tapes, or maybe we didn't have an airline, or we had both. So data quality is important. I don't think it should be confused with data integrity because they're a little different. But I think the data are out there.
So before I got into GIS and database management, I was doing surface water hydraulics. And our former president, he would always walk into our office and say, "It's not a diamond, stop polishing it." So we have good data, and we can make decisions on that. Could we have better data? Yes, definitely. Newer technologies, more efforts, you can always make your data better. But I think that goes back to your slide, Glenn. You know, there's a cost to collecting data, and we need to have value out of it. And we want to make sure we're getting the value out of the efforts we put into it, so we do have a good return on investment. And so you need to find the right balance of when do you stop collecting data, or you know, how many parameters around that particular piece of data do you need, and make a good judgment call on, you know, where you stop on the data collection part.
Well, first off, I love crappy data. And I'll explain why. You know, it's like beggars can't be choosers, and there's a lot of groundwater data, but there's never enough as you would want. You know, you always want more. You know, with groundwater models, there's something called hydraulic conductivity, which is something you use to describe how quickly water can flow through an aquifer. And to get hydraulic conductivity numbers, you ideally want a pumping test, you know, 24, 48 hours, ideally with observation wells. And you just don't get very many of those. I'm thinking back to early modeling work I did on the Ogallala Aquifer, where maybe there were 12 for the entire Ogallala Aquifer in the High Plains. But what I did have was some crappy data, which were specific capacity tests that drillers do. So they measure how much the water level goes down for a certain amount pumping. Guess what? That's related to hydraulic conductivity. And there I had thousands of measurements. And so leveraging the dozen or so that I had of real tests with this other information, and then of course making sure it made sense, I was able to leverage a much deeper understanding of the aquifer than I had if I hadn't used that data. Data quality is in the eye of the beholder. For a long time, the U.S. Geological Survey didn't consider data of the Water Development Board as good enough. And Janie Hopkins, when she was at the board, she's recently retired, worked with the advisory committee on water information to get information imported in. But the board, sometimes I'll be like, well, let's get that data from those groundwater conservation districts, and sometimes staff are like, well, that data is not very good. It's all good data. One thing that's important is to have metadata, so data about data that tells you something about that data. And then, in essence, kind of warning people that be careful about using this. You might need to be at a higher expert level to truly understand what's going on.
So I'm going to compare Texas data and our data landscape to the landscape of pretty much the rest of the world. In my opinion, Texas comes from a very data-rich place. We've got many reasons to brag. I'm going to throw in a shameless plug and also say, because I forgot to earlier, Texas Advanced Computing Center just a few weeks ago, we also have the 5th fastest computer on Earth, y'all. 5th fastest. There's nobody better than Texas. And we also have some of the best data, so I'm working on saying, woo, woo, woo. Well, okay, well,
Top 5.
Still, come on. We rock. It's the fastest academic computing system. Anyway, that's not the point. The point is, I'm working on projects that are actually with other countries around the world, regional countries, most of which are smaller than Texas, and none of which have the data resources that we have developed through the efforts of many of our state agencies. And thanks to our groundwater districts, all of the water and the models that we've got in this state are just almost incomparable. And so we are in one of the best positions ever. Do we want more data? Of course. I'm a scientist at heart. I want perfect information at all times, at all places, around the globe, everywhere, consistently, forever. That's not realistic, but I think that the value of the data that we have right now gives us enough to begin to understand what are robust choices we can make moving into the future, what are more conservative or safe and you know, choices that will make us less vulnerable to risks in the future. And I think we've got a great foundation to build on for that.
Great. A question for Erin. You are fortunate to work with so many different districts, some individually, some collectively. What do you think every other GCD that you've perhaps not worked with, what do you think they should know? If you had to whittle it down to one or two things, what should they know about water data?
If you're not collecting it, start. As Mike said, you know, it may not benefit you today, but it's going to benefit other people greatly down the road. So start collecting your data right now. You know, the other thing is, don't just collect the data and throw it over in the bucket and know that you have it. You're going to need to be able to get to it. Make sure that you're collecting it in a ordered and mannered fashion. You're going to have to maintain and groom and take care of it because at some point you've spent all this effort to collect your data. How are you going to get it back? You need to be able to pull that back so you can answer your question. So, you know, I'd say if you're not doing it today, get started. If you are doing it, congratulations. Look at your processes and the quality of your data. You know, collect more. I'm a data geek. You know, the more the merrier. But what are you going to do with it? So think about how you're going to implement that going into the future.
Similar question for Mike. With you wearing a general manager hat, but also with your 17, 18 years at USGS, what message would you have for a general manager perhaps who isn't as sophisticated in water data? Where should they start?
Well, there's a lot of talented folks in the room that know a lot about the hydrogeology in Texas, and that's a good place to start if you don't have that background. But honestly, if you're trying to develop a data program or trying to nurture a data program that you already have, look for opportunities to show the value to your boards, and that value is important. We can throw a lot of money, a lot of resources at data collection, but it's difficult to get that done with our board of directors if we don't show the value that we get back from that. And you know, in the case of the Subsidence district, that value was very important. You know, we got 8 million people. We got a lot of infrastructure going in, so you got to have good information to do that. And in your area, it may be about the coming change to land use or the needs for improved agricultural uses or whatever you're dealing with. But making that case for your board is important, and bringing in those resources off the street if you don't have them on your staff is what I do every day. I mean, I bring people in to talk to my board to talk about how they're using our information or how they depend on our regulations and how important that those regulations are based on sound information is to them and their boards and their constituents. So making that case is important.
Suzanne, when you and I talked before the panel, you pretty elegantly described some of the things you're working on that frankly are 5-10 years out. And I wanted to ask you a question. So let's fast forward 5-10 years. What are you working on today that you hope most GCDs work and use in the future?
Oh gosh, there's so many things. So we're working on a model integration platform. It's called Mint for model integration, and it is a system that takes well-labeled data and metadata about that data and information. It takes the models like your groundwater availability models and SWOT models for surface water and soil moisture models, and we label those. You register that information in a catalog, and we are actually building that part of the system today for Texas because Texas is a data-rich example. We're using it so that we can compare it to other scarce data regions. And we're building it with the GAMs themselves. Once you put that information in, the computing environment then says to you, a user says, I want to go to West Texas, I want to build a model for this region, and they can draw a box on the region, and the system pops up for you a set of recommendations that says, here are the kinds of data that you would need, or here are the kinds of data that are available, here are the kinds of models that are available, what's the problem that you're interested in looking at today? And so we're trying to sort out right now, how do we help people describe their problems? What's the thing you need to make a choice on that we can describe for you? And so the idea then is, and we've now set it up so that you can kind of drag and drop like Lego bricks. So you drag and drop your data and your models together, and then you build a workflow that can run through and do the analysis for you. So it will accelerate things so people don't have to spend as much of their effort cleaning and futzing with data, but they can actually kind of pull it all together quickly, run it, and they can start to look at results and visualize those results. So we're automating this system that will help you to reason and think and consider about problems more quickly and easily. So it is like the Netflix for groundwater, if you will. So that's where we're going right now.
Robert, a question for you. With the April 2018, there was a convening of a bunch of Texas water data folks. You were there. A number of the people in the audience were there as well. And now you're helping coordinate this Texas Water Data Initiative. In your opinion, given what you've heard and your experience in helping build tools, what does Texas need now? Like if you had to create your top 1 or 2 list, what does Texas need now in terms of water data?
Great question. So when I was at the board, just a little bit of background, when I was at the board, we wound up getting some funding from the Mitchell Foundation to look at data, water data, and creating a data hub, which it's basically it's a place where data is freely available, and you can bring it in and then do analysis with it in a very easy and transparent way. And we also worked with Rudy Rosen at Texas A&M San Antonio on that effort. Where we also kind of worked with putting together or supporting what the Water Development Board did when they asked for funding for a flood dashboard that came on the heels both of the flooding in Hays County as well as of Harvey. And underneath that flood dashboard is the hub. So it's like the structure, the future structure for a water hub for Texas. And the board's going to focus on flood information initially. On the Water Data Initiative, we've chosen 2 use cases. So basically, it's what would we use this hub for? There's the flood dashboard, but we're also looking at developing a drought dashboard. We've been dealing with floods lately, but drought will come back. And then also looking at developing a tool to look at surface water, groundwater interaction, which many of you know is becoming a bigger issue in the state, both across the state and with the Texas legislature.
So I'm about to open it up to Q&A, and I see Leah's writing down a lot of questions. So let's take questions, and Leah, you want to come up and...
I'm just going to clarify. We're still number 1. We're number 5 in the world, but we're the only non-commercial supercomputer. I have to clarify.
We've got some great questions that came in. The first one, from a GCD's perspective, what are your thoughts on proceeding with continued permitting, especially with large-scale projects, before there are adequate data or scientific tools?
I mean, we have a regulatory plan that's based on the information that's been gathered in the region and the landscape of the district, and that regulatory plan is implemented by our rules. Our rules dictate how we permit. So if you have a regulatory plan or a management plan, in the case of a GCD that has a rules that support that, then you permit to those rules until those management plan changes. I mean, a lot of folks think they don't have data when they really do. And it's a matter of going out and interrogating the available information. The management plans are based on something. And ideally, the best thing that I've found from data is that, well, not the best thing, one of the good things that you get from data is that it'll highlight from you what you need to collect. If you have good information, it does a really good job of highlighting where you may need more information. And certainly we need to be going down those roads when we can to help fill in the gaps in our data sets.
I might just throw in on that, agree with everything Mike said, but having an adaptive component to how you permit. So a lot of times districts are choosing to prevent something from happening and don't want to give a permit and then find out 2 years down the road that oops, that was too much. So having the ability to kind of adapt and respond, whether it's a clawback clause or something like that, to respond to once the data comes in, because you can always model these things, but sometimes you have very little data and you really don't know what's going to happen until you do it.
I think you have to be very careful on how far on the limb you go.
Right.
Great. So the next question, do you think collected data will play a role in defending desired future conditions and future water production curtailments? And does the data make things more legally defensible?
I'll go ahead and take it. I'll let you take it too. I think data does make things more legally defensible. Assuming that it's been collected properly and it's not fake news data. With defending implementation of desired future conditions, there are some questions there in terms of, is the data collection currently enough for a district or districts in a GMA to evaluate whether or not they're achieving a desired future condition. A lot of times the data, maybe it doesn't exist if a district doesn't have a monitoring program, there's only a handful of wells the Water Development Board develops or measures, or the data that you have is biased towards the area where there's pumping, where there's wells, and maybe you don't have data in large parts. And so there's some challenges there, and how do you come up with an estimate of your water level decline if that's what your DFC is based on. But I would say data's data. Ruben Solis, who I used to work with, Surface Water Development Board, always said facts are friendly. And I would agree with that.
So sometimes facts are friendly. Facts can also be a little bit hard to understand and put into context of what's important about them that's relevant for your decision, right? So sometimes you think you're in conflict with someone, and I think that one way to look at it is, Erin was talking about start collecting data like today, because it becomes more valuable over time, and that's very true. The more data you can have, the better you can describe the system and how it's going to respond. One of the things that I think is interesting when you do get into a conflictive situation, and if you've gone to the courts, then by that point it's really severe, is that basically you need to think about the policy implications and the relative uncertainty that we can give you in terms of if you change pumping rate at this well or in this location or this zone of your aquifer, how is that realistically going to impact the response at your springs? Or you need there's a band of uncertainty, and sometimes the policy sensitivity in that system is not so great. So people who take a position that they think is in conflict, which it may be in conflict, anti-impervious cover and urbanization, let's say, no more urbanization, no more build out. That's a fine position. But it's possible that restricting the amount of build-out that happens is irrelevant in terms of what our data and our information can tell us about the impact to the aquifer system. And so you may find that when you're setting a policy, the thing that the data and the modeling can help you determine is, do you have a real impasse issue, or is this more of a discussion about a principled difference among people? So maybe we just can't agree eye to eye, but it's possible you're using the policy choice as the kind of lightning rod, And it's possible that the science and data will tell us that it's not the lightning rod that it's become in the human interaction. I don't know if that helped.
Anyone else going to respond to that one, or?
I'll flip the question around. What's it going to look like if you're in a legal dispute and you don't have any data at all? I really don't think you want to be in that situation. So I guess from that argument, having some data does, help the legal defense. But if you don't have anything, then what are you going to stand on when you're looking at your decisions that you're making?
All right, so another one that came in. So with groundwater as a private property right, how do you address landowner privacy issues and data ownership?
Carefully, I guess. There's certainly proprietary data out there that you have to be mindful of, particularly when you get a public information request. But all of our permits are public records. Those are the information that we're most concerned about. Water use is a condition of your permit, is a public record. And those information, water use is by far the most valuable piece of information that we collect. It's an important piece of the puzzle. So, we have to be mindful of that, but at the end of the day, a lot of the information out there that some folks like not to get out there really end up becoming public records as a part of the permitting process.
In the computing systems, the way we're handling it is when you log into our data portal, you authenticate. So you log in, we know who you are. Your data is your data, and you decide who you're going to share it to. And so you can, click, I want to share this with my colleague, I want to share this with my neighbor. And then there's another choice that you can put it into a community-centered folder. Once you put it into that community sharing space, we set the rules up in advance that say, if you put data here, it's public and it's available, but that's the choice of the person who's controlling that data going into the system. So we're trying to kind of let it be self-governed in that people come into the system and they choose how, when, and where they allow access to their information.
So the personal information obviously should be protected, but if everybody hoards their data, then nobody's ever going to share, and the answers aren't going to get better over time. So you do need to find some way to be transparent with the data that affects the aquifer as a whole, not just the district, but out to the GMA and further out. So there does need to be a balance for how you share that information, because if everybody can develop a little trust between each other, then they're sharing data back with you that you may benefit from as well.
And that data really does need to be open, because imagine if I came with a groundwater model, I'm like, and maybe you have some questions about it, which maybe you should, and I can't share half the data with you that the model's based on. You're going to have to take my word for it. That just doesn't work very well in the public sphere. At the state, we took the position that it had to be publicly available data going in, because we wanted everybody to go in. You could trace back where each data point came from, and then have the ability to go in and verify that, okay, I believe this structure surface, or I believe Robert did his magic on the crappy data correctly, and that the model is correct. So, but there are some state laws that protect kind of personal information, but then it's also interesting that there's certain requirements that you have to submit, like your name and address and phone number on water well driller reports and stuff like that aren't necessarily protected.
Okay, another question, and this actually I think goes back to some of the context, Glenn, that you provided. When you consider making, the data value greater than the cost, usually we know the cost. How do we know the value? And is it really important to quantify that value?
I really love all the questions. These are amazing questions.
Yeah.
In my opinion, this is all about incentives and behavior change, because a lot of what is out there are suboptimal decisions. People are making the best decisions that they can, but often with imperfect data. And so, you have to create enough incentive from multiple stakeholders, kind of to Robert's comment, both public and private, proprietary, because otherwise that data will stay in silos. The value will never exceed the cost. And so you need to choose case examples, instances, a specific decision context where sharing data among adjacent districts makes a lot of sense, that they get to a better outcome. And it's our belief that if you can quantify that, in particular financially, you'll get to real change. Because without that financial incentive, it's always this perception that the downside is worse than the possible upside. And so there's almost fear that overtakes using data. So quantifying that financial value is often really quite important.
And there is one more question that we had. The last one I've gotten is there a need for GCDs to standardize what data they collect and how they collect it? And the second part of that question was, should the state require data, more data be collected by GCDs?
Want me to go first? Yeah, it makes things easier to have standardized data formats. And when I was at the board, we're probably talking 10 years ago, maybe more, we had a great idea about let's get all this great data the districts are collecting. And a chunk of it does come in. The water level information, a lot of that comes in, but there's also water quality information that doesn't come in, at least when I was there. But we looked at, hey, could we create an incentive for districts to share their information with the Water Development Board? And it would require putting together this standardized format. And that did not go over very well back then. And understandably so, because y'all have got how you've done things so far. You're comfortable with it. Maybe the standardized format doesn't work as well for you. But what could be done is maybe there's a coalition where I call them translators, where there's a translator that automatically takes your data and puts it into a format that others can then pull in and integrate and make decisions with. And then as long as there's a communication from the district, and maybe it's the board to the board that, hey, we're changing our database to make sure that translator gets updated at the same time, there's no gap in data delivery, then things could happen that way, which might be a kind of an intermediary step towards data sharing. And then maybe at some point in the future, there is a standard that everybody can agree on to benefit everybody, because it certainly makes things a lot easier when you're trying to harvest data if everybody's got a similar format. In terms of the state mandating data collection, I think that's tough. As y'all know, some districts are wealthy, and then some don't have anything. They barely have 2 dimes to scrape together, and so an unfunded mandate on data collection would be a struggle for many districts.
Yeah, the only thing I would add to that is that I think you're right on. I mean, and if there was a standardized format for everything everywhere, that'd be great. But you're right, the implementation of that is arduous right now, and having some other tool that can get your data to fit into the same fields as his data does, that's great. But I don't know that we should go to a point where everybody's required to collect these parameters, because everybody has different needs for their data. And whether you got a big pot of resources to pull from to collect data or a small one, I think the best advice that the state can make is to figure out what you need and start developing mechanisms to collect what you need. And then building complexities from there. I think that's the best approach to take, is to start with the simple, easy things that you can get that'll help inform your decisions, and then build in the complexity as your decisions become more complex. That's kind of the way we've approached it.
I'll say that in terms of implementing it, looking towards the future for how we help, computers help you find data and use data, we're seeing that makes a lot of sense. And, if there are 13 standards today, the minute someone asks, should we have a standard? Well, now you've created a 14th standard. And so I don't think that that creating new standards is necessary, but one thing we've been looking at is how do you make sure that, first of all, as you collect the data, you're keeping the information about it that describes it so you can look at it later or someone else can look at it later and understand it. The next thing is when you want to share it with someone, what are the minimum pieces of information you need to tell someone about that data so they can use it. And now what we're looking at is for a machine to be able to find that data and help a human discover it. We are using a translator approach. It's called a scientific variable ontology. And what it is it's a label, so you just add another column, and it doesn't have to be done at the time of collecting your data. We can go through and append it after data collection, and that makes your data variable or parameter that you're collecting now recognizable to a myriad of different model interfaces, simulations, advanced analytics, artificial intelligence, ingesters, all kinds of things. And it's a tiny little thing. You add one little column in your data, and you add the name of what that parameter is, and all of a sudden, doors open wide, and information can be connected more easily.
Should there be a mandate? Absolutely. I mean, just kidding. So with data standards, I think the data steward should establish a standard so that they can consistently collect the same data over and over. Now, should the state dictate a standard? Not so much. But what they should outline is, what are their requirements? What kind of information is the state looking for so that you can review those requirements and decide whether or not you want to put them in your data standard? We've got the first fastest computer in the world with access to it. So even if you have 99 different standards across all the GCDs, we've got a computer that will convert it and give it to the state. I mean, converting data and moving it from one format to another, that's easy. That's not a big deal. But as far as standards, I think you ought to, internally within a single entity, a single district, you should be following some kind of standard so that you have data integrity and reliability.
As I was driving down this morning, I had a thought that open data is kind of just like open marriage, right? So three rules I came up with. Everybody needs to be on board. Right? So everybody needs to be in agreement. There needs to be some boundaries. Clear vision of what's going to get shared, not going to get shared. The data standards and the format. And then 3, no one comes home with a virus. So data security and...
How long was that drive?
Leah, should we end it on that note, or should we let the others?
I don't think we want to go any further. That was fantastic.